A husband humiliated his wife for years, but when she left, he saw something that made him freeze. The world saw them as the perfect couple. He was a successful businessman, confident and charming, while she was the devoted wife who managed their home with grace. From the outside, everything looked flawless. Friends envied their apparent happiness, and family members praised their stability. But behind closed doors, the reality was different. The man she had married, once affectionate and supportive, had gradually become someone she barely recognized. His words, once filled with love, now carried sharp edges. The compliments turned into subtle criticisms, the admiration into indifference. At first, she dismissed it as stress from work. His business was growing, and he often came home exhausted. She convinced herself that his occasional coldness wasn't personal. But the remarks became more frequent, the looks of disappointment more common. Whenever she shared an idea or a thought, he would smirk and wave it off as unimportant. If she made a mistake, no matter how small, he made sure to point it out. "Why can't you be more organized? Why do you always forget things?" The words weren't shouted, but they didn't have to be. Each one chipped away at her confidence, piece by piece. One evening, while preparing dinner, she excitedly told him about a book she had been reading, something that had truly inspired her. He barely glanced at her. "You always get these little ideas," he muttered. "But they never lead to anything." She felt the sting of his words but forced a smile. "I just thought it was interesting," she said softly. He shrugged and continued eating, as if she hadn't spoken at all. The dismissiveness hurt more than direct insults. It made her feel invisible, as if her thoughts and feelings didn't matter. She tried harder to please him, keeping the house immaculate, making his favorite meals, dressing the way he liked, but nothing seemed to be enough. No matter what she did, there was always something wrong, something inadequate. Deep down, she began to wonder if she had imagined the love they once had. Was it real, or had she simply seen what she wanted to see? His words followed her everywhere. At first, they were small comments about insignificant things, her forgetfulness, her way of speaking, her interests. But over time, they grew sharper. If she laughed too loudly in public, he would shake his head. "You're too much sometimes," he'd say, a tight smile on his lips. If she made a suggestion, he would dismiss it with a condescending chuckle. "You don't understand how these things work," he would say, shaking his head as if amused by her ignorance. The worst moments were when they were around other people. At dinner with friends, she would start to share a story, only for him to cut in, correcting her details or finishing it for her as if she couldn't do it herself. "No, that's not what happened," he'd say, rolling his eyes. "She always gets things mixed up." The others would laugh awkwardly, unsure of how to react. She would force a smile, pretending it didn't matter, but inside, a knot tightened in her chest. She began second-guessing herself, overanalyzing every word before speaking, afraid of saying something stupid in his eyes. The joy she once had in expressing herself slowly disappeared. The woman who once dreamed of starting her own business, of doing something meaningful, now felt small and insignificant. She started believing his words, that she wasn't capable, that she didn't have what it took to be anything more than what she already was. The breaking point came at a party thrown by his colleagues. She had spent hours getting ready, choosing a dress he once said he liked, hoping to make a good impression. She wasn't naive, she knew he had little respect for her, but she still held on to hope that, for one night, things could be different. As they arrived, she noticed the way he changed around others. He became charming, confident, the perfect conversationalist. It was a stark contrast to how he treated her at home. As she stood beside him, trying to participate in conversations, he made sure to remind everyone of her shortcomings. When someone mentioned their business ventures, she chimed in, sharing a thought. But before she could finish, he laughed. "Oh, my wife likes to play with these little ideas, but she doesn't really understand the real world." The words felt like a slap, but the laughter around her was worse. The humiliation burned her skin as people smirked, exchanging glances. Someone tried to change the subject, sensing the awkwardness, but the damage was done. She wanted to disappear. For the rest of the evening, she stood silently by his side, nodding along, pretending she was fine. On the way home, she didn't say a word. He didn't notice. Or if he did, he didn't care. The party had changed something inside her. She had spent years excusing his behavior, telling herself it wasn't that bad, that he didn't mean it. But that night, for the first time, she saw how little he valued her. It wasn't just indifference, it was deliberate. He wanted her to feel small. She replayed the moment over and over, feeling the shame creep up her spine. Every time she had laughed off his comments in the past, every time she had chosen silence over confrontation, she had given him more power. She realized then that she had been shrinking herself for years, trying to fit into the mold of the woman he wanted. But no matter how much she bent, it was never enough. The resentment started growing, slowly at first, then with more intensity. She began to see the pattern in everything he did. The way he never thanked her for anything, the way he expected everything but gave nothing in return. She thought about how much she had sacrificed to make this marriage work, her dreams, her confidence, her voice. And for what? A man who didn't even respect her? For the first time, she asked herself a question she had been too afraid to face. What if I left? Once the thought entered her mind, it wouldn't leave. She imagined a life without him, a life where she didn't have to walk on eggshells, where she could speak freely without fear of ridicule. At first, the idea terrified her. He had always made her believe she couldn't survive without him, that she needed him to navigate the world. But was that really true? She started paying attention to other women, businesswomen, single mothers, independent professionals. They had built their own lives. They had confidence. If they could do it, why couldn't she? She wasn't sure how, but she knew one thing for certain. She had to get out. The realization that she needed to leave consumed her thoughts, but fear held her back. What if he was right? What if she really couldn't make it on her own? The doubt lingered until one evening when she overheard a conversation she wasn't meant to. He was on the phone, laughing, speaking in a voice full of arrogance. "She wouldn't last a month without me," he scoffed. "She has no skills, no ambition. I practically carry her." The words hit her like a punch to the stomach. It wasn't just that he didn't love her, he saw her as nothing. She stood frozen, the weight of years of humiliation pressing down on her. For so long, she had believed that if she just tried harder, he would see her worth. But that night, something inside her broke. She wasn't worthless. She wasn't weak. She had simply forgotten who she was. As she lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, she made a silent promise to herself. She wouldn't stay a second longer than she had to. She would leave, and she would prove to herself that she was more than what he had reduced her to. The next morning, she felt something she hadn't in years: clarity. The fear was still there, but now it was accompanied by determination. She knew she couldn't just walk out without a plan. He controlled everything, the money, the house, the accounts. If she left recklessly, she would have nowhere to go. So she started planning in secret. She searched for jobs online when he wasn't home, reached out to an old friend for advice, and slowly began setting aside whatever cash she could find. Every dollar she saved felt like a step toward freedom. She didn't tell him. She knew he would either mock her or make her doubt herself again. Instead, she played the role of the obedient wife for a little longer, pretending everything was normal. But inside, she was counting the days. She practiced what she would say, how she would walk out the door and never look back. She was terrified, but she refused to let that stop her. He had taken enough from her already, her confidence, her happiness, her sense of self. He would not take this moment too. Days passed, and she continued her preparations. She found a small apartment that she could afford with the little savings she had, secured a job that paid just enough, and waited for the right moment. But then, as if sensing a shift, he grew crueler. His words, once passive-aggressive, became openly venomous. One evening, she served him dinner, only for him to push the plate away. "You can't even cook right," he muttered, shaking his head. "What are you even good for?" She stood there, staring at him. There was no anger in his voice, no frustration, just cold, detached disdain. In that moment, she knew she had nothing left to fight for. The man she had once loved was gone, if he had ever truly existed. Without a word, she turned and walked to the bedroom, closing the door behind her. She sat on the bed, hands trembling, and took a deep breath. "Tomorrow," she told herself. "Tomorrow, I leave." The morning air was crisp as she stood by the door, suitcase in hand. He was in the kitchen, sipping his coffee, oblivious to the fact that this was the last time he would see her as his wife. Her heart pounded as she cleared her throat. "I'm leaving," she said, her voice steady. He looked up, confused at first, then amused. "Leaving where?" he chuckled. When she didn't respond, his expression changed. "You're serious?" he scoffed, setting his cup down. "And where exactly do you think you'll go?" She met his gaze, feeling the years of hurt rise in her chest. "Anywhere but here," she said simply. For the first time in years, she saw something flicker in his eyes, panic, perhaps. But it was too late. He scoffed again, masking whatever he felt with cruelty. "You won't last," he said, shaking his head. "You'll come crawling back." But she didn't reply. She simply turned the knob, stepped outside, and closed the door behind her. Freedom felt strange. The apartment was small, barely furnished, but it was hers. The silence, once suffocating, now felt like a relief. She no longer had to measure her words, anticipate criticism, or shrink herself to fit into someone else's idea of who she should be. She was alone, and for the first time, that didn't feel like a bad thing. But reality hit quickly. The job was exhausting, and the money barely covered rent and food. There were moments when doubt crept in, whispers of his voice echoing in her mind. "You won't last." She forced herself to push past the fear, reminding herself why she had left. She had spent years believing she was nothing, that she couldn't survive without him. But she had already done the hardest part. She had left. And if she could do that, she could do anything. The first few weeks were brutal. She was exhausted from work, drained from worry, and overwhelmed by everything she had to figure out on her own. But every day, She reminded herself of one thing: she had made it this far. Each paycheck, no matter how small, felt like proof that she could survive. Each meal she cooked for herself, each bill she paid, was a step toward rebuilding her confidence. She started finding joy in small victories. A promotion at work, a kind word from a coworker, the realization that she could do things she once believed impossible. She wasn't just surviving, she was learning to thrive. The version of herself that he had tried to destroy was slowly re-emerging, stronger than before. Months had passed when she saw him again. She had been running errands when she heard a familiar voice call her name. Turning, she saw him standing there, eyes widening as he took her in. She was different now, stronger, more confident. Gone was the timid woman who second-guessed herself. He stared at her, as if trying to reconcile this version of her with the one he had known. "You look different," he muttered, his voice lacking the usual arrogance. She tilted her head, studying him. He looked the same, but something was off. Was it regret? Curiosity? She didn't know, and she didn't care. "I am different," she said simply, offering him a small smile before turning to leave. For the first time, she walked away from him without fear, without hesitation. And he? He just stood there, watching her disappear, realizing too late what he had lost. As he stood there watching her disappear into the crowd, something unfamiliar settled in his chest, an ache that wasn't anger or pride, but something far worse. Regret. He had always assumed she would struggle without him, that she would come crawling back, admitting that he had been right all along. But seeing her now, standing tall, carrying herself with confidence, it was undeniable: she had thrived without him. The realization stung more than he expected. He had spent years convincing himself that she was nothing special, that she needed him. But what if the truth was the opposite? What if he had been the one who needed her? For days, he couldn't shake the image of her face, the self-assured expression, the way she had looked at him without fear, without the desperate need for approval he had grown so accustomed to. He found himself replaying their past, but now, for the first time, he saw things differently. The way she had once lit up when she spoke of her dreams, only for him to dismiss them. The way she had tried so hard to please him, while he had never once truly appreciated her. He had spent so long thinking he was superior, but standing in front of her that day, he had felt small. And for the first time in years, he found himself asking a question he never thought he would: had I been wrong all along? The days stretched into weeks, and a strange emptiness filled his home. It had never been warm or inviting, but now it felt unbearably cold. He would come home to silence, to an empty dining table, to rooms that once held her presence but now felt hollow. At first, he had convinced himself that it was just an adjustment, that he would get used to it. But instead, the loneliness grew heavier with each passing day. There was no one to greet him, no soft laughter in the background, no warmth in the space that once held a woman who had loved him unconditionally. At work, his mind drifted more often than he liked to admit. He thought about the little things, the way she used to hum while cooking, the way she would leave small notes on the fridge, the way she had always made an effort to ask about his day, even when he barely acknowledged hers. He had taken it all for granted, assuming she would always be there, assuming she had no choice but to stay. Now, the absence of those small gestures felt suffocating. He had spent years making her feel like she wasn't enough, but now he was the one left feeling incomplete. One evening, unable to fight the restless thoughts any longer, he found himself dialing a number he hadn't used in months, her old friend, the one he had always dismissed as a bad influence for encouraging her independence. When she picked up, there was hesitation in her voice, as if she was debating whether to hang up or give him a chance to speak. He hesitated, unsure of why he had even called. I just wanted to know how she's doing. The silence on the other end was heavy before she finally spoke. She's doing great, her voice held a note of satisfaction. She's happier than I've ever seen her. The words hit him harder than he expected. He had known she was different when he saw her, but hearing someone else confirm it made it more real. Did she ever? He trailed off, rubbing a hand over his face. Did she ever talk about me? Another pause, then a sigh. She used to, the friend admitted. At first, she struggled. She questioned if she had made the right choice. But now? Now, she barely mentions you. She's moved on. The call ended soon after, but the words stayed with him. She's moved on. He should have been relieved, should have let it go. But instead, it only made the ache in his chest grow stronger. It wasn't long before fate, or perhaps his own desperation, led him to cross paths with her again. This time, it wasn't accidental. He had found out where she worked, a small but promising business she had started. He stood outside for a long moment, debating whether he had any right to step inside. But the need to see her, to understand what he had lost, overpowered his hesitation. When he finally pushed open the door, the sight before him took his breath away. She was there, speaking to a customer, her expression full of warmth and confidence. There was a light in her eyes that he hadn't seen in years, maybe he had never seen it at all. And then, as if sensing his presence, she turned. Their eyes met, and for a moment, he forgot how to breathe. But instead of the shock or discomfort he had expected, her face remained unreadable. No anger, no sadness, just quiet recognition. And that was when he realized the most painful truth of all. She no longer needed him. She didn't ask why he was there, didn't react the way he had secretly hoped she would. Instead, she excused herself from the conversation she was having and walked toward him with measured steps. What do you want? Her tone was calm, controlled. It was not the voice of a woman who had been waiting for his return. It was the voice of someone who had healed. He swallowed hard, suddenly unsure of what to say. He hesitated, running a hand through his hair. I wanted to see you. To talk. She studied him for a moment before nodding, leading him outside where they could speak in private. The silence between them stretched, heavy with everything left unsaid. Finally, he broke it. I was wrong, he admitted, the words feeling foreign in his mouth. About everything. About you. He had expected relief at finally saying it out loud, but instead, all he felt was the weight of too many wasted years. She remained quiet, waiting. So he continued. I treated you terribly. I made you feel small because I was too blind to see how incredible you are. He let out a breath. I don't know if it means anything now, but I'm sorry. She looked at him for a long time, and for the first time since she had left, he saw something flicker in her eyes, something unreadable. Then, after a long pause, she simply said, It does mean something. But it doesn't change everything. And with that, she walked away, leaving him standing there, forced to accept that forgiveness did not mean she owed him another chance. For the first time in his life, he wanted to be better, not for appearances, not to prove a point, but because he finally understood what he had destroyed. He started therapy, confronting the ugly truths about himself. He reevaluated his life, his choices, the way he had treated not just her, but everyone around him. He had spent years believing he was superior, only to realize he had been the weakest of them all. The process wasn't easy, but for once, he didn't run from the discomfort. Months passed, and he became someone different. He no longer sought control over others. He no longer used his words as weapons. He let go of the arrogance that had once defined him. And when he saw her again, he didn't expect anything. He only wanted to show her, "I have changed, even if you never take me back." Time passed, and with it, his desperation faded, not because he no longer cared, but because he had finally accepted a truth he had once been too arrogant to see. She didn't owe him another chance. No apology, no grand gesture could erase the years of hurt he had caused. He had to change for himself, not for the hope of winning her back. And so, for the first time in his life, he let go of control. He threw himself into self-improvement, not out of guilt or a need to fix the past, but because he had finally realized the kind of man he wanted to be. The difference became evident to those around him. At work, he no longer spoke over others or dismissed their opinions. With friends, he listened more than he talked. The arrogance that once defined him slowly faded, replaced by quiet self-awareness. He still thought about her, of course. Some nights, he lay awake, remembering the way she had looked at him the last time they spoke, calm, collected, unmoved by his remorse. He had lost her, maybe forever. But he had gained something else, the understanding that his happiness could no longer depend on someone else's forgiveness. While he was changing, she was living. Her business flourished, growing beyond what she had ever imagined. She no longer doubted her worth, no longer sought validation in anyone but herself. There were still moments of loneliness, times when memories of the past threatened to creep in, but she no longer let them control her. She had spent years being made to feel small, and now, she refused to let anyone, including herself, diminish her again. She had heard whispers about him. Friends mentioned that he had changed, that he was different now. At first, she dismissed it as meaningless. People didn't change, not really. But then she saw it with her own eyes, at a business event where they unexpectedly crossed paths. He was speaking to a group, but something was missing from the man she had once known. The sharp arrogance, the need to dominate the conversation, it was gone. He wasn't performing, wasn't trying to impress. He was simply present. And that was when she realized the most unexpected truth of all, maybe people could change. But did that mean she was ready to let him back into her life? One evening, after a particularly exhausting day, she arrived home to find an envelope slipped under her door. No text messages, no dramatic confrontation, just a single letter with his familiar handwriting on the front. Her hands hesitated before opening it, her heart pounding in a way she hadn't expected. Inside, his words were simple, yet profound. He didn't beg for a second chance. He didn't try to justify the past. Instead, he acknowledged everything he had done, every cruel remark, every moment of neglect, every time he had made her feel unworthy. He wrote about how, for years, he had believed himself to be the strong one, only to realize that she had been the stronger of the two all along. He admitted that he had spent too long taking love for granted, assuming it would always be there, until it was gone. And then, at the very end, he wrote the only thing he had left to say: "I don't expect forgiveness. I don't expect anything. I just needed you to know that I see it all now. And I'm sorry." She sat there for a long time, staring at the words. A part of her had expected manipulation, expected excuses. But there were none. Just honesty. And that, more than anything, unsettled her. She carried the letter with her for days, reading and rereading it, trying to make sense of the emotions it stirred. It wasn't just about him. It was about everything: the woman she had become, the freedom she had fought for, the life she had built on her own. Was opening that door again a betrayal of everything she had worked for? Or was it possible to acknowledge the past while still allowing room for something new? Her friends had conflicting opinions. Some told her to forget him, that he wasn't worth the risk. Others reminded her that people could grow, that she should at least hear him out. But in the end, the decision wasn't about them. It was about what she wanted. And after everything, there was only one way to find out if she was truly ready to face the man he had become. When she finally agreed to meet him, it wasn't in a dramatic setting. No candlelit dinner, no emotional airport reunion. It was a simple cafe, neutral ground. When he walked in, he looked different, not in appearance, but in the way he carried himself. There was no expectation in his eyes, no attempt to charm his way back into her life. Just quiet sincerity. They spoke for hours, not as the couple they once were, but as two people who had lived through something painful and come out the other side. He didn't ask for another chance, but he did say something she never expected: "I understand now why you left. And I'm grateful for it. If you hadn't, I never would have changed." She had expected remorse, maybe even sadness, but gratitude? That caught her off guard. It made her realize that maybe, just maybe, he had learned the most important lesson of all. She had spent so long building walls around herself, protecting the woman she had fought to become. Letting him back in, even in the smallest way, felt like a risk. But as they continued to talk, she realized something: he wasn't asking her to go back to the past. He wasn't trying to erase everything that had happened. He was simply asking for a chance to be in her life again, in whatever way she chose. That night, as she lay in bed, she thought about everything. About the pain, the humiliation, the loneliness. But also about the growth, the lessons, the woman she had become because of it all. And for the first time, she asked herself, was it possible to forgive without losing herself? She didn't say yes to anything immediately. She took her time, testing the waters, seeing if his change was real. He never pushed. He never tried to rush her. And slowly, something unexpected happened. She started to enjoy his presence again. Not in the desperate, painful way she once had, but in a quiet, steady way. One evening, as they walked through the city, he turned to her and asked, "Do you ever regret leaving?" She thought about it, about the woman she had been and the one she was now. Then she shook her head. "No," she said. "Because if I hadn't, neither of us would be here." He nodded, understanding. And for the first time, they smiled at each other, not as the people they used to be, but as the people they had become. Their renewed relationship was nothing like their past. It wasn't rushed, nor built on desperate attempts to hold on. This time, there was patience. He no longer interrupted her when she spoke, no longer dismissed her thoughts. Instead, he listened, truly listened, as if her words had value, as if she mattered. And she did the same. She no longer sought his approval, no longer felt the need to prove herself. She was complete on her own, and that was what made their connection different. For the first time, they were building something real, not out of dependency, but from a place of mutual respect. Still, old wounds didn't heal overnight. She had moments where she doubted, where memories of past humiliations resurfaced. But the difference now was that she spoke about them. She told him when something hurt, when she felt uncertain. And unlike before, he didn't dismiss her feelings. He faced them, acknowledged them, and reassured her not with empty promises, but with consistent actions. This time, love wasn't about control or power, it was about choosing each other every single day, without force or fear. One evening, as they walked along a quiet street, he hesitated before speaking. "I still think about the way I treated you," he admitted. "And I hate myself for it." His voice was raw, stripped of any arrogance. "I used to believe I was better than you. That you were lucky to have me. But the truth is, I was the lucky one." She looked at him, seeing the weight of his regret in his eyes. For years, she had dreamed of hearing those words, of watching him finally realize the pain he had caused. But now that he had, she felt something unexpected: peace. She reached for his hand, not to erase the past, but to acknowledge the present. "I don't need you to hate yourself," she said softly. "I just need to know that it will never happen again." He squeezed her fingers gently, nodding. "It won't," he whispered. And for the first time, she believed him. Not because she wanted to, but because he had proven it. Months passed, and what once felt uncertain now felt steady. Their love was no longer fragile, built on fear of losing each other. Instead, it was strong, built on the understanding that love wasn't about ownership, it was about freedom. She had once feared that forgiving him meant losing herself again. But now she saw the truth. Forgiveness wasn't about erasing the past. It was about acknowledging the pain, learning from it, and choosing to move forward without carrying its weight. One evening, as they sat on the balcony of her apartment, watching the city lights flicker in the distance, he turned to her. "Are you happy?" he asked, his voice filled with quiet hope. She thought about it, the life she had built, the strength she had found, the love she had rediscovered. Then she smiled. "Yes," she said. "For the first time in a long time, I am." And as he pulled her close, she realized that happiness wasn't something he had given her. It was something she had found on her own. And that made all the difference. They took their time, allowing their relationship to grow naturally, without rushing toward a destination. Marriage, commitment, a future together, none of it felt like an obligation anymore. It was a choice. And this time, she knew she was making it for the right reasons. Not because she needed him, not because she was afraid of being alone, but because she truly wanted to share her life with him. The difference was profound. One afternoon, as they prepared dinner together, a simple, quiet moment that once would have been filled with tension, he looked at her and smiled. "I used to think love was about having control," he admitted. "But now I know that love is about trust. And I trust you more than anyone." She looked back at him, feeling the truth in his words. He had spent years breaking her down, but now, he was spending every day proving that he had changed. And more importantly, she had changed too. She was no longer the woman who would accept anything less than what she deserved. Their journey had been painful, filled with mistakes and regrets. But in the end, it had led them here, not back to who they once were, but to something new, something stronger. Love wasn't supposed to be perfect. It wasn't supposed to be easy. But it was supposed to be built on respect, kindness, and growth. And now, finally, that was what they had. As they sat together, hands intertwined, she realized something. She had spent so much time believing that love had to be earned, that she had to fight for it, prove herself worthy of it. But now, she understood the truth: real love didn't require suffering. It didn't demand pain as payment. Love, at its core, was simple. It was choosing someone every day in their best and worst moments, not out of fear, but out of a deep, unwavering appreciation for who they truly were. And as she looked at the man beside her, the man who had once torn her down but had fought to rebuild himself, she knew one thing with certainty. This time, they had found the love they were always meant to have. And this time, it would last, not because they were holding on to it too tightly, but because they had finally learned how to hold it just right.